Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to EVA, the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences, and this event by the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, Combat Climate Change, the Importance of Innovation, Entrepreneurship and New Technology. My name's Maddie Savage. I'm a journalist based here in Stockholm. I'm passionate about tech and innovation, so it's great to be here. I'll be introducing all of the speakers and moderating today's panel discussions. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome a couple of important faces from the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, Managing Director Anders Borström and Professor Pontus Brannhjelm. Please put your hands together. Thank you. Let's start with Pontus. You've organised this event, so what can the audience expect?
Well, combating climate change becomes increasingly urgent. And we know that taxes is a powerful instrument and probably a necessary, but the question is if it is a sufficient policy instrument to mitigate these climate changes. I and a few other economists think that we need to put more emphasis on technological change, innovation, entrepreneurship. So that's what we're going to discuss today, I hope, and the need for a new set of policies, actually, or more emphasis on already existing policies, perhaps.
Great. I'm sure it's going to be some really engaging discussions. And Anders, why is it important for the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum to have events like this?
It's important for us to contribute to the most challenging and important issues of our times, necessarily. And of course, I mean, combating climate change, I need to say no more. That is, in a way, has been the defining challenge of my lifetime, I would say. And to me, innovation, entrepreneurship in this debate, it becomes increasingly clear to me that we need to look for important answer there. So we have to efficiently meet this challenge. On the one hand, we're dependent on a willingness among the public, among us, to perhaps also sometimes to abstain from certain things and in general to behave in a way that is coherent with what science tells us needs to be done. On the other hand, we also need, we have what the world needs to, how much the emissions need to go down and so on. And innovation, entrepreneurship and technological change moves this barrier all the time by inventing new more efficient ways to produce things. But also I think it's in an important way affects our own willingness to contribute by showing it's possible. So in some way new technology can lead to complacency if we think they will solve that. But I think the more important message today for us is that technology also shows the way, and entrepreneurs show the way by showing it's possible, also facilitating, I think, us to want to take those extra steps to make this happen.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Pontus and Anders. Thank you very much. Okay, just a couple of administrative points before we bring on the first panel and speakers. First of all, this event is being recorded and it will be published online later. So if anyone does have a problem with being spotted in the background, please mention that to the event's organisers. Also, we want this to be interactive, for the audience to have a chance to ask questions. We're quite a small group, so don't be shy. You will be able to put questions to the speakers if there's time after each panel discussion. And there's a little microphone next to each and every one of your chairs here. So that's how we'll organise that. There's also roving microphones if we need them. Okay, so we have 3 fascinating sessions coming up before lunchtime with a break in the middle. We've got some leading experts and decision makers from here in Sweden and academics from top universities around the world. The first topic is called Accelerating Innovation and Technological Change. And what we're going to do is we'll have 3 short presentations, each followed by a discussion from the panelists. And before we bring on our first speaker, I am going to introduce our first panel. So please welcome to the stage Lena Håkansson, Vice President and Head of Public Affairs at H2 Green Steel, which is working towards cutting almost all emissions from the steel production industry. I didn't tell you this, my fault. Could you start on chair number 3? I'll sit here and the speakers will sit there. My bad. Next up, Helene Samuelsson, a senior manager at Energiföretagen, which is a non-profit industry and special interest organisation for companies that supply, distribute, sell and store energy. Patrick Söderholm, economics professor at University of Luleå in northern Sweden, and also Laurence Torvat, member of parliament for the Swedish Green Party. Thank you very much for joining us. And so our first presentation for this section has the title... Yes, my apologies. Niklas Johansson, Director of Communication and Climate Unit at the Mining and Minerals Company, LKAB. Sorry, I was so anxious to get to our next presentation. All right, so the title of our first presentation is Economic Diversity and the Paradox of Carbon Pricing. And for that, let's welcome Michael Grubb, Professor of Energy and Climate Change from University College London.
Thank you very much. Sounds like the microphone's working. And yes, for the title you just gave was a deep workshop yesterday, and I don't think I can cover all of that in 5 minutes, so I've chosen a much simpler title of Policies for Transition. But it does pick up some of the themes from a more detailed, if you like, economic theory discussion yesterday. I've just got 3 slides, starting with some history, but recent history. For those of us who've actually likewise spent something of a career in this space, it's encouraging to realize in some ways how much has changed in the last decade. So this chart is drawn from the recent IPCC report, and it shows what's happened to the cost of the 2 biggest sources of renewable energy, namely solar and wind energy, and also the cost of batteries. The grey bar across is the range of fossil fuel prices. So we are now in a world in which actually clean energy, electricity, I should stress, is as cheap or cheaper than the majority of incumbent fossil fuels in much of the world. How did that happen? Well, that's part of a long story across the top about how technologies actually evolve, and they go through multiple stages that start with basic R&D, applied, demonstration, expansion, commercialization, economies of scale, learning by doing, financial confidence, lots of other things that lead to wide diffusion. And the point I want to make really is that actually these breakthroughs were largely achieved due to policies that were adopted despite, not because of, some of the mainstream economic advice. And I've shown quotes there from well under 10 years ago that said, this is madness, these renewable energy policies. They're so expensive if you measure the static per unit cost of emission reductions at the time. But of course, that was never really the game. The game was evolving the technologies and building up the industries at scale. So what's going on here? A way of capturing it is this sort of conceptual chart, because actually most things evolve, they grow, they start small, you have lots of uncertainty, lots of what in the field we call niche alternatives, experimentation. Some will fail, but some will gain a foothold, start to grow, and may take years to emerge at scale. And in that initial phase, you may also not be very visible, the impact on incumbent industries. But it is coming, and over time, what happens will tend to involve substantial reconfiguration of existing infrastructure and market structures. And that's a sort of simplified, and there's lots of theory about how these processes, technical term in the middle is you've got a socio-technical regime of how you currently organize the system to suit incumbent technologies, and it's when that starts to shift, along with the cost reductions from those processes I mentioned, that you get these big breakthroughs. And that's not an easy process. It's not automatic, and this cannot all be driven just by saying, let's get a carbon price, though obviously something like that helps. My third and final point is, so what is the role of policy in these kind of directed transitions? Well, it involves an evolving mix of complementary policy instruments, and that's really what we focused on more in the seminar yesterday. Strategic investment broadly to foster the emerging technologies and the businesses, and to really get the technologies into the leading adopters, those who are either just inclined to want to buy stuff, or emerging niches where it's particularly valuable, or other factors that, the leading adopters that help to build the scale. Then to get that really lift off and involved in that reconfiguration, no question, markets are incredibly important, and it depends both on the structure of the market and the relative pricing and the kind of incentives that come and flow from carbon pricing, for example, to help start the lift off of bulk adoption. Often, and in many cases, depends somewhat on the technologies, but attention to the standards, the norms of behavior, the expectations can help to enhance the adoption. And just think of energy efficiency. How much is left untouched that is basically economic? Because people don't get around to it, or they don't know it, or they don't trust it, or whatever. So that sort of semi-social around getting the full adoption of these technologies is also very important. So broadly, we structure this in terms of 3 pillars of policy and argue that it's not about which is right. You need all of them, but there is a certain phasing as to how you can drive and accelerate these transitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Come and have a seat with us. You can take the second one, and I'll give Lena charge of that microphone. Brilliant, thanks very much for the first presentation. And I'm going to get some reactions from the panel. I'd like to start with the political perspective. So, complementary policy instrument selection. What do you think?
First of all, thank you for having me.
Is that on? Yeah.
There you go.
Perfect.
Thank you for having me, and I would say I would really agree on almost everything that was said. I mean, if you look at different countries and their strategies, you can see that, for example, Denmark has been really world leading on new technologies, and Germany, of course, and they have a strategy that's based on not just CO2 taxes, but also investments and new investments in new technologies. So I really agree on the overall standpoints.
Okay, what about industry? Nicholas, I'm not going to leave you out. I'll let you go next.
Thank you. No, I think this was a very clear-cut explanation. And looking at where we stand in Sweden today, I think one of the areas where we have to dig deeper into is the market. You know, I'm Senior Vice President LKAB, and we're doing this massive transformation. And it comes to bulk. How do you adopt new technology when you can actually do it? Just for everybody to understand, last year we shipped 27 million tons of iron ore products. That's a number which is difficult to get to. But if I say that with the wonderful market prices of last year, we've made 20 billion SEK in profits after tax, and we actually got 1.70 krona per kilo for our product in harbor. So when you're changing these big ones into climate efficiency, changing our entire iron ore production into fossil-free, carbon-free sponge iron will actually save something between 40 and 50 million tons a year at our customer sites in the steel industry. That's as much as Sweden's entire carbon emissions. But if you want to change this raw material flows, which we need to do in order to do that, it comes to scale. And if you get 1.70 krona per kilo for your product, well, you cannot do this gradually because it becomes so much more expensive. You have to do it big time. You have to do it in big leaps, large industrial transformations. And then you can see it doesn't have to be that much more expensive. And just like you said, what we've seen when it comes to new technology, photovoltaics, wind power, battery technology, this goes down. That's the same thing we see that will happen for hydrogen. So basically, if we can make these big steps, fossil-free steel doesn't have to be more expensive to do than old-time steel in a few years. maybe in the middle of the 30s. That's what we're looking at. We see that it's going to be worth more, but maybe it doesn't have to be more expensive to do. But it's extremely big, this transition. Just our company will actually need electricity for hydrogen amounting to 2 times Denmark. 70 terawatt hours of electricity a year. Can we get that? That's half of Sweden's electricity production today. Of course not. You can't take half the electricity. But can you build it? Yeah, you actually can. The prices, the market prices for wind power today is good enough for this transition to be possible. So actually, you can build it. But in order to do that, we need to get into a lot of issues when it comes to planning, regulation, and how to do that, which is very difficult in our present system and crashes with a lot of our...
What do you mean, political and administrative hurdles?
Yeah, but basically there's the question of land use. So basically all this transition has to go at the same time. So you need grids, you need new wind power, or maybe in the future new nuclear power. You need the transition of the mining sites, new factories. You need the steel industry to change at the same time. Because if this all things in this value chain do not change in the same time, the risk will be too big.
Let's bring in Lena's perspective. You mentioned green steel, and we have a representative here. So your thoughts on the presentation and anything you'd like to pick up from Nicholas. And also to all of the panelists, feel free to jump in if there's anything you're passionate about or disagree with. But go ahead, Lena.
Okay, thank you, Maddie, and thanks for the kind invitation to participate in this conference. It's really urgent and it's really important. So my company, H2 Green Steel, you might have read about us if you're from Sweden at least. We're actually a large-scale hydrogen company, I would say. But our first installation, we are right in the middle of putting up in the northern part of Sweden, in Boden. And we're going to produce green steel at that location. We are going to start up by building the world's largest electrolyzer, producing an 800 megawatts electrolyzer to produce green hydrogen. And from that hydrogen, we will produce green iron, which will be used to produce green steel. So we're actually a really scarce species, I would say, because we're an industrial startup. You don't hear that word so very often, but we're a startup company in an industrial scale, which is really, really different and poses a lot of both possibilities and, of course, challenges. So the main drivers for our company, of course, has been, I would say, policy. Putting clear targets on climate emissions that we're going to decrease and be net zero by 2050. That's the most important and clear signal from start. Also having a carbon price. I mean, the ETS system here in Europe is essential for us to make to put the pressure on the customer side. But I would say that now we're actually in a position where the companies are driving this. The customer base are driving our investment. We have already pre-sold 60% of our production, and we're just starting to build a factory. And this is due to customers having science-based targets, looking at their scope 3 upstream emissions. For example, the automotive industry or the white good industry, also construction is interested in this green steel. So now we see that we can actually get, I mean, Nicholas mentioned it's going to be more expensive, yes, but the customer side is actually interested in paying more for this product. It's a unique product and it has much lower CO2 emissions to attach to it, so they are prepared to pay a green premium for this. So we see that we have the front runners, the companies that actually have the science-based targets or similar, but we need policy still to make sure that the ones lagging behind also get the pressure to transform. So we still see that the ETS system, as I said, to putting a price on the carbon emissions, that's the most important tool to make the level playing field that we need to make sure that our product is the one that is the winner in the future.
Thanks very much. Patrick, I'll let you go next. Strong pitch from the industry spokespeople here, but how confident are you? Do you really think that that this kind of dramatic change can happen at the pace at which the industry here in Sweden are saying it can?
I think what you're mentioning is the critical thing is the pace. I think I'm pretty definite that this will work in the end. But how?
Can you just pop your? Just flip it up, or you can use that one.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think the critical question is really the pace at which this development may take place. I think that it can definitely be done, but
Is that one working? The one that Helena has? We'll try with that one.
yeah, again, I think the pace is really the critical issue here. I think because if you look historically, these kind of structural shifts, they take they take decades basically, and here we are talking about perhaps 2 decades at the maximum. But then when I listen to the presentation, I think that was a very good summary of my own view that, we definitely need a carbon price as some kind of necessary condition. It's like the engine of climate policy, if you like. If we don't have that, there will be no demand for carbon-free products, processes, and so on. So we really need that. But we also need support for technological change in different ways. That will make the sort of engine more efficient, if you like. And also sometimes you also have to sort of take into account political obstacles and institutional change. Because what Michael was telling us is that you cannot always sit and wait for costs to go down. You have to invest in order for them to go down. And I think that also applies in some ways to institutional change. That sometimes new technology will force institutional change. So it's not that easy just to level the playing field and then sit and wait for things to happen. As Niklas mentions, to some extent, things has to come in a certain order, and that makes it even more difficult, I think.
Thank you. Let's bring in Helene's perspective from the non-profit sector.
Well, in Sweden we have a production of electricity that's 98% fossil-free. So we're really already there in the stage that we are talking about. But that's not the issue here. And so far, the carbon taxes, that has done that transmission. I think Sweden was the first country to introduce a price on carbon in 1991. And we also have the highest price on carbon, and that has really made that transition. But now when LKAB and H2 Green Steel and a lot of other industrial entrepreneurs, if you could call them that are doing this really change, and it's not only the base industry, it's also the transport sector are going fossil-free and going into electricity. Our demand on electricity will be about twice as much in 2045. And then this is when it's getting really complicated. And this is when we have to, then timing is essential. We need the demand from the customers. We need industries like LKAB. And we also need the politics and the authorities to make sure that we have the policies aligned with those really brave goals that we are setting in Sweden.
And how confident are you about that? I mean, we've heard from the Green Party, but there's 7 other political parties here in Sweden.
In Sweden, if you read the papers or if you talk to the industry, everything that we really demand, everyone wants to invest in green electricity production. Everyone wants to invest in new grids that are needed. We also need electricity in other parts of Sweden that we needed before. The north of Sweden will be a heavy user of electricity. Before they were the producer of electricity and transported it to the south of Sweden. So we need to build a lot of more grids, and we also need to invest in much more electricity. And here is when the policy and the are lacking. It's not in line with all those investments that needs to be done. So also we have to, in governmental, we have to make sure that we have the human resources to handle all the permits that are being put into to build, for example, wind powers plants. So we're not really in line. The politics and the governments are not really in line with the brave goals they set and the bold decisions that the companies have been taking.
So the pace that Patrick was
Exactly.
mentioning. I do want to give the audience the chance to ask a couple of questions, but I know Lorenz and Lena have been scribbling and sort of gesturing. So I'll give you guys a quick response, and then we'll take probably 2 audience questions for this session. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that we need so many different kind of measurements here. I think the lesson learned from northern Sweden is that we have the climate framework in Sweden, for example, and we have the ETS mentioned before. We do have the Industriklivet, which is the state, what do you call it? Subsidy. For it as well. And we do have the wind and energy that wouldn't have been built except for if it wasn't for the subsidies as well. So we see that the policies are really important in this case. We wouldn't have the same development in northern Sweden without it. And I think that's the lesson here. And I would say that the carbon price is crucial, but Germany didn't succeed in making solar the cheapest energy source in the world with a CO2 tax. They had policies and subsidies around it. And I think that's one of the lessons here. And also from a political point of view, I think I represent maybe the party that is mostly putting forward the high taxes on carbon, and it doesn't look so good for us. So it's also a question about social acceptance. And then you need different kind of measurements and all. Once again, look at the Germany and the Germany Energiewende that started 20 years ago. It has social acceptance and people do support it. So I think, the combination of different measurements are the thing that works here.
Yeah, Lena.
Yeah, regarding the question, if policy is doing its job or not. I mean, last week's debacle in the European Parliament when it came to the vote on ETS system clearly shows that the policymakers are not doing their job, I would say. And I think it's also really clear to see for that particular vote, the European steel lobby, Eurofair, did a strong push towards not changing anything. The main thing for the ETS right now is getting rid of all the free allowances that the incumbents are receiving. They have been essential from the start of that system, but ETS has actually been in place for more than 15 years now. So it's about time to phase out the free allowances and phase in something new. We are proposing to put more money, the auction revenues from the system, into the innovation fund, for instance, and to make sure that those funds are used to drive the innovation that, for instance, Lawrence is talking about. Use that for subsidies, but use it in an EU harmonized manner, because what I fear now is that all states, all member states of the EU are going in for their own subsidy schemes. And in that context, we won't get the level playing field within Europe, and we won't get the most efficient climate investments. Yeah. So that's my greatest fear.
Yeah, good points. And I feel that could take us into a whole other realm if we're talking EU-wide policies. But thank you very much. Some really interesting insights. Is anyone brave enough to ask the first question? It would be really nice to get a bit of interaction from the audience. Yes, in white. Perfect.
Hello, I'm Eva Krutmeier. I would like to know a little bit from you, Professor Grubbs, and perhaps the others, about going from a linear to a more circular economy, and what kind of policies do you see would be more important there? Because now we've been talking about more electricity in, more material in, more virgin materials, but we also need to circulate what we have, and we need to use energy of different quality more wisely than we do, and we need to save actually material, resources and energy. So can we also use innovation to go to such a future? Thank you.
You've got a mic on.
I've got a mic on.
You're good.
I don't need that. I certainly don't need to, particularly since I'm not an expert on the topic. So, I mean, we have seen a growth of the circular economy, more use of materials recycling. It is quite a specialist area. I'm not an expert in it. It's clear that it again involves quite a lot of issues around the complex management of the chains of waste handling, the recovery, the reprocessing. And one of the things I think is where it helps to build a technological bridge that can merge, if you like, growing rates of recycling at one end, which help to pull down the need for primary, plus the new primary technologies. And again, an obvious example is in the steel sector, where we see the countries that have had a greater amount of recycled steel going into electric arc. Electric arc is also a foundational part of the technology for green steel in many of its manifestations. But I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I mean, we have been making headway on recycling, materials efficiency. In the IPCC report, I would stress there's, for the first time, a whole chapter devoted to, if you like, in the use and services, which has a framework called the ASI framework. Avoid, shift, and improve in that kind of order. Try and avoid the volume of usage, shift the kinds of technology that you draw on, and then improve the ones that you have. And I think that's a good way of structuring our attempt to get to agree with this. Obviously, part of those first two categories really is making better use of things before we throw them away. But I don't have ready, there's no single easy answer to the recycling. It's part of the evolution of these whole industrial systems.
Thoughtful response. Thanks very much, Professor Grubb. And any final comments based on the panel? Pace of change came up quite a lot, whether we can get politicians on board with these radical changes, whether the electorate will vote for those policies. Any final comments on the panel discussion?
Well, I think on the last of those, will the electorate vote? It really, the answer is, given time and information, yes, and we've seen that in the progression of voter behaviour across certainly a lot of northern Europe, including the Commission elections, which, if you like, laid the foundations for more ambitious action in this. I think, though, it's an ongoing struggle, and you cannot expect people to follow through policies which simply require them to pay more for stuff without a clear narrative of how that contributes to solving the problem. And we had a discussion in the workshop yesterday about the fact that it is striking what Scandinavia has achieved. People may not realise just how important the Scandinavian leadership and some of these technologies and fields really is, and that's absolutely the case around green steel. Don't underestimate the extent to which those of us, even in other parts of Europe, let alone in the world, are looking at the kind of things you've just been talking about and thinking that is really, really interesting. It helps to give many people confidence there are ways forward. And in time, people, if they see that vision, and to some extent, if they trust the political and policy processes behind it, then you get the public support coming in and backing it up.
Thanks. Nice to leave the first discussion on a positive note. Professor Grubb, thank you very much. All right, I hope you all got a lot out of that. Caroline's got her microphone ready, waiting in the wings, and she's going to be our next speaker, focusing on green bonds and carbon emissions, Professor of International and Public Affairs from Columbia University, Caroline Flammer. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for coming. Now, green bonds. What are green bonds? Green bonds are bonds whose proceeds are committed to finance environmental projects such as renewable energy, green buildings, resource conservation. Let me just give you a couple of examples of green bonds that have been issued. So several public and private entities have issued these in the past. The very first one has been issued by the European Investment Bank in 2007 for the financing of renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. Then another example is Unilever, which in 2014 issued a 250 million green bond to cut in half the amount of waste water usage and greenhouse gas emissions of existing factories. And the last example that I'm going to share with you is Apple, which in 2015 2016 issued a 1.25 billion green bond to finance the installation of more energy efficiency and cooling systems and an increase in the company's use of biodegradable materials. Now, these are by no means the only companies and entities that have issued green bonds. In fact, there has been a downright green bond boom ever since the start of this market. Here you're looking at the first 10 years of this market. So you can see in 2007, this market has started. And ever since then, it has really exploded, both in terms of billion of dollars being issued as well as the numbers of green bonds being issued. Now, let's not fool ourselves. The green bond market is still a tiny fraction of the overall bond market. Okay, it's very, very small. But what is striking is the tremendous growth over time. And if we looked nowadays, this has increased even more. All right. Now, in terms of issuance across countries, what you can see here are the main issuers of green bonds. So China is taking the lead. So here we are looking at green bonds having been issued by governments and corporations. So Chinese companies and governments, then France, followed by the US and several European countries. Apologies for not including Sweden in the blue box. If I was more diplomatic, I would have included it in the blue box. But it almost made it, okay? Now, here you can see the map, which shows you exactly the same thing. Again, green bonds have been primarily issued by China, the US, France, and several European countries. And then let me now move to the evolution of green bonds across regions. So more generally speaking, not just with respect to green bonds, but when it comes to sustainable finance, Europe is really taking the lead here. And this is also reflected in this graph, followed by North America, and then what is striking is the stark increase in Asia, and obviously 2015, 16 coincides with the Paris Agreement. Okay, all right. Now, lastly, let me share you the green bond issuance across industries. So, as I mentioned, governments have been really the leading issuer in that. That is basically the oldest market, so to speak. But then among the others, the corporate green bonds, it has been the financial institutions, and then among the industrials, particularly utilities and industrials and energy. You might wonder now, wait a minute. These industries are very emission-intensive industries. Why would it be particularly emission-intensive industries that issue the most green bonds? It just screams like greenwashing. Apologies for anyone here on the panel, okay? Isn't this just greenwashing going on? Why is it particularly emission-intensive industries that issue the most? Well, at first, this is striking or surprising. At the second thought, it's not that surprising because it is especially these industries that have the highest potential for change and the highest need in signaling that they want to improve the sustainable business practices, okay? I'm going to get back to that later on, and here you just see the evolution of green bonds across industries. Again, governments have been the first ones having issued green bonds, followed by corporations that really kicked in 2013 onwards. Okay, all right. So, all to say, the market of green bonds has been exploding over the past couple of years. But despite this increase in green bonds, we actually know very little about this financial innovation. There are a couple of studies on the pricing of green bonds, but what are the real effects of green bonds? We don't really know. So do green bonds deliver on their promise and yield overall improvements in environmental performance, or are they just a tool for greenwashing? Now, this greenwashing concern is a particular concern because of the lack of public governance. So from a legal perspective, there's no difference between a green bond and a regular bond. And this makes you wonder, especially when it comes to companies, why on earth would a company issue a green bond if it could simply issue a regular bond? And then if it turns out to be that the green project is a valuable project, it doesn't even have to be the most valuable project. They could just simply use the proceeds of the regular bond and invest them into a green project. Nothing would prevent them of doing so. So why would a company from the get-go tie its own hands and say, we are only going to focus on green projects, okay? So there's an enormous greenwashing concern out there. All right. Then another question is, do we observe a substitution effect? It has been governments traditionally that have issued green bonds, but as corporations kick in, do we observe that potentially governments now step back on issuing green bonds? Another question is, in absence of public governance, what role does private governance in the role of a third-party, independent third-party certification play in governing this market? And last but not least, what are the implications for climate innovation, for ensuring a just transition, and for public policy? Let me skip the data methodology section here and go straight to the results to make sure I stay within 5 minutes here. So what are the implications for emissions? First, I'm looking at state-level changes within the US here. What I find is, regardless of what specification I use, that after the issuance of green bonds, we observe a decrease in emissions. And more specifically, for every $1,000 of green bonds per capita being issued, we show an association, a subsequent decrease in state-level emissions by about 0.8 to 1.4%. Okay, which corresponds to an average reduction by 165 to 257 metric tons of CO2 for every $1 billion of green bond being issued. Similar results I obtain if instead of looking at state-level data, I look at across the globe, cross-country, very, very similar, again, a decrease in emissions by about 1.4%. Okay? This suggests that green bonds could potentially serve as an important tool in financing the transition to a low-carbon economy. Now, I mentioned the lack of public governance and the enormous concern about greenwashing. So let's see, do we observe any difference between those green bonds that are certified versus those that are not certified? So this is what I do here. I split those green bonds into those that are certified versus not. What I find is, okay, I skipped this slide. What I find is the results are only significant, large and significant for those bonds that are certified. In other words, only certified green bonds lead to a subsequent decrease in emissions. There's nothing going on when it comes to non-certified bonds. What I observe at the state level, I also observe at the cross-country level, suggesting that greenwashing concerns are legit. They exist and they're legit for uncertified green bonds. But certified green bonds can help decrease emissions. Okay? All right. So let me conclude and discuss implications for practice. So the main results are that green bonds can potentially serve as an effective tool in the financing of the fight against climate change, and that certification plays an important role in the absence of public governance. Now, this by no means means that private governance is the most effective way of governing this market. Most likely, a mix between sorry, I can't speak anymore. A mix between public and private governance is probably ideal. Now, there are several open questions and concerns that remain with respect to green bonds and actually ESG fixed income instruments more generally. The first question is, what means green? There is no clear definition what really green means. Okay, they're more like shades of green. Secondly, there are multiple taxonomies which may complicate the effectiveness, efficiency, and integrity of the market. A third question and concern that is out there is the binary certification. Certification at this moment is 1-0. It's either certified or not. Ideally, we would have a tiered certification scheme which would be much more informative, similar to credit ratings. And last but not least, there's the question about additionality. Would the companies have invested in green projects anyway, even without issuing green bonds? We have a similar discussion going on when it comes to carbon offsets. Okay? So these are all open questions. We have not discussed them, we have not resolved them in terms of the green bonds market. And so all to say, we need more research, we need much more policy discussion around this to govern this green bond market. And this leads me to the very last slide, and it's about the transition to a low carbon economy. We know that, first of all, we need major investments in order to transition to a low carbon economy, and we need climate innovation. Furthermore, we also know this transition can potentially raise important social challenges such as job losses in certain industries, dying industries, geopolitical tensions, etc. So how do we transition to a low-carbon economy without worsening social inequalities? Could potentially green bonds and related ESG fixed income instruments be an important tool in ensuring such a just transition? We don't know. Okay? Again, more research is needed, and we also need to know, how is climate innovation really financed? Do green bonds help? We don't know. Okay, I'm leaving you with way many more questions here than I'm answering, but I stop here.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Caroline, I'm going to come and take a seat here. Managed to get through a lot of material there, so thanks very much for that presentation. I want to start with the economist's perspective. Patrick Söderholm.
I have two very general remarks, actually. I think one thing that pops in my mind here is that when policymakers are to implement new policies, they have to have some idea about the business as usual scenario. And I think that is much more difficult now than it's ever been, actually, because we have reached some kind of momentum where industry is taking many important steps themselves. But we also see that in this case it's very difficult to know how important, how honest are these steps actually. So I think that's one important lesson. And I think also I have very few I haven't been digging into this research specifically on green bonds, but I think the second sort of general remark is that I think it's a good idea that there is some kind of diversity in the policy field. That we saw that with renewable energy, which was mentioned here, that it was actually quite a good thing that European countries were left to their own to decide on the specific policy instruments, because then we can learn from the mistakes and the good examples of that. And here is one interesting, definitely, sort of option where potentially the government can play a role, but we need to know more about that. But then we can learn from the experiences also in this case, I think.
Thank you. Do you want to pass the mic to Helene?
Well, I'm not an expert in green bonds, but it was very interesting. But of course, anything that will guide investments or how the public should choose their goods and their any industry that they want to buy their stuff from, should not be at least any way considered to be some sort of greenwash. So of course there have to be some way that we can make sure that there will be anyone that says that it's a green bond should trust that it's really a green bond. And then we also have we have to make sure that everyone knows what green is, because today, anyway, when anyone says something is green, it just screams greenwash. So we have to be really sure, what do we mean by green?
Yeah. Really interesting with the comparison with carbon offsetting, where you can click on a button and be told that that's what's happening, but you don't really necessarily know that each company is acting in the same way.
Yes.
Let's bring in the political perspective from Lorenz.
Well, thank you. There were so many questions in the presentation, so I'm a bit confused almost. But from my point of view, I would say that green or public green bonds would be a way of lowering risks in general for big investments. And I think different kind of investment have different challenges ahead. And I think that, so for example, these transformative big investments, they are quite risky. And from my point of view, I would say that there is some reasons for the public to helping by lowering those risks, and I think that's the good thing about green bonds. I would say public green bonds, and then of course we do have this challenge, which is what is green and what is additionality. And I mean, we do have examples of airplane companies having green bonds that is maybe not that green if you are true to yourself. But then on the other hand, you have battery factories that is really, really important for the transition of the transport sector, for example, that really needs lowering risks. So yeah, it's a hard question, but I think it's a good measurement.
Lena, you were gesturing.
I can tag on there, of course.
Yeah, from the industry side.
Yeah, we're building a totally new factory, as I told you. We're raising more than 40 billion Swedish crowns, 4 billion euros for this investment. So, of course, getting the lowest interest on that money that we need to loan, and also, of course, getting the right investors with their private capital is really important for us. And as Lawrence mentioned, I mean, the biggest concern there from the lenders are the risks. And the risks are actually mostly coupled to the policy measures taken. I mean, we need to get our environmental permit to be able to build the factory. We need to get the electricity grid to the factory. And all those issues are actually to some extent hindered or pushed through by policy. So it makes sense for policy to be the ones lowering that risk, I would say, from a societal perspective. But then I also wanted to comment on your items list and the bottom. I mean, the definition of green and what you mentioned also, Helene. This is really a tricky one because it's not black and white. You got the question about circularity, and I mean, we will be using scrap in our product. To use scrap is actually the easiest way to get lower emissions from your end product, steel. But it doesn't abate the carbon curve for the iron industry, the iron sector globally. To do that, we have to do the investment to produce green steel, which both LKAB and we are doing. So to put that in a perspective and see that it's not only about using the scrap and circulating, but also that what is added, we need a new influx, and that has to be green as well, or fossil-free. It's not black and white, and I think like a scale of something, it's not binary. That is an important part of this.
Yeah, and in terms of credentials, I mean, obviously it does appear that you're working very hard to be true to yourself, but in a field where a lot of other companies are just calling themselves green or promising to offset carbon, how do you kind of relate to that? Because in some ways it could be sort of weakening your brand as green if others aren't living up to those ideals.
It's really tough. I think you have to have a really good contact with your customers. I mean, also for us to put our factory up in the northern part of Sweden is because it's abundance of renewable electricity, hydropower and wind power. And of course, you could set up a factory in the middle of Germany where you have a lot of coal power in the electricity mix, in the grid mix, and you can buy your guarantees of origin and say that we only buy wind power. But actually, it's not only wind power going into that installation. So of course, you have to have this dialogue with the customer, and you have to, and we as end consumers, I would say it's not only about the industry doing the right thing, but we as end consumer has to get involved, has to get more knowledgeable, and also ask the right questions to the companies that we buy products from.
Thank you, Lena. And last but not least, Niklas.
Is it on?
Hard to tell from here.
There you go.
Yes.
No, I think there are some elements I can comment on here. I think Lena said some very interesting that I agree on here. We were the first mining company to issue a green bond. And of course, one of the things when you're looking at taxonomy or things like what is green, etc., and how do you actually abate carbon dioxide in the whole steel industry, which is mainly what we're into. You need prime material as well. You need that because scrap is not going to be enough. So how do we change that? Because otherwise, if we don't do that, steel industry as a whole will emit the same in 25 years as they do today if they are not able to transition to electric arc furnaces. And you can't do that with just scrap. You need to change the whole value chain. And of course, then if you look into taxonomy, there comes a lot of opinion about, mining can never be green or something like things like that, because it's not black and white. There is a lot of things, and you have to make sure that you find the right ways to do that. Another thing also, that's the same, we're doing that in when it comes to circularity, looking at what we are wasting today, because basically we are digging up a lot of iron ore from the ground, but it's not just iron ore we're digging up. There's a lot of appetite, and we're now just started public discussion on a new industrial park in Luleå in order to take out the first step. Don't waste it at all. Instead of putting this on deposits, to take out apatite in order to make phosphorus for mineral fertilizers, amounting to 5 times the need of Sweden's agriculture sector. Rare earth elements, amounting to about 30% of Sweden's or Europe's need a few years back, but just as raw material, very much less when it comes to actually going into the final industry. But big, large projects in order to try to do that in a circular way, because actually markets open up. And now with the new geopolitical situation after the war in Ukraine, we're looking at because we have one deposits of iron ore and phosphorus just next to us that we used to look at in a 20-year perspective as the pension insurance of Kiruna, but basically the phosphorus content is so high that we could actually see that if we start mining this, we can actually take care of all of Russia's export of phosphorus to the European Union, which makes a lot of new opportunities when it comes to this and deal with this, but we have to do it. And of course, all these investments, we're looking at investing between 10 and 20 billion kroners a year for a period of about 20 years in order for the whole transition. That's a lot of money. Or even if we're making quite some money today, that's not something you're counting on doing for every year for 20 years. So there will be need of financing for these kind of investments, and green bonds is definitely an interesting thing in order to do that, because just as Lina said, well, we actually want this to be as low cost as possible, even though that what we're mostly concerned with is, of course, electricity prices. We need as low electricity prices as possible. You want low electricity prices, I want low electricity prices. No one in Sweden wants electricity prices as low as LKAB does in the future, I can promise. But yeah.
Yeah, some really interesting, relevant points, thank you. And also raising the point of some of the sort of ultra-green campaigners. There are, of course, people saying that any kind of industry can't be green, so it is worth bringing that perspective in, although we don't have any of those on the panel. We've got time for a couple of additional questions from the audience. It'd be really good to get some involved. Yes, sir, you've got your microphone just next to you.
So John Hassler from Stockholm University. So I have a question to Caroline. So there's a lot of effort going into preventing greenwashing, and as I understand it, you call for more of that. So one would like then that there is a causal relationship between green bonds and emissions, and the way you framed your result, you claim that there is a causal relationship. Issuance of green bonds lead to less emissions. So this is a very tough thing to actually claim, and it's very challenging to establish such a causal relationship. So I would like to hear how sure you are about that and how you have kind of prevented misinterpretations.
Oh, it's not causal. So, no, this is...
Okay, because you said that issuance of...
Subsequent.
Lead to.
It's a subsequent, what we observe is a subsequent decrease.
So it could, for example, be that something else drives issuance of green bonds as well as less emissions, in which case there is no causal relationship.
Yes, okay. So in what I showed you at cross-national level, I cannot claim causality, I would never do so. Just be clear. I have another study where I focus on corporate green bonds. Again, I cannot claim causality because it's just not possible. It's an endogenous decision. It's a strategic decision to issue green bond. I hope it's a strategic decision, correct? And it's a strategic decision to decrease or not emissions. There's just no way you can claim causality. What you can try to do is rule out all sorts of potential alternative interpretations to get as close as possible to a causal interpretation. And so this is what I do in another study that is published in the Journal of Financial Economics on corporate green bonds. Again, very carefully phrased. It's not causal, but it does suggest that those companies that issue green bonds, certified green bonds, that they show a decrease in a substantial decrease in emissions, suggesting that the issuance of green bonds signals to the outside world that they intend to decrease or improve their sustainable footprint, okay? That they try to improve their sustainable business practices. So it's rather like a signal of, but it's not causal. So I want to be very, very careful, and thank you for picking that up. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other quick burning questions? Yes, we can take one quick question and one brief answer, if that's okay.
Yeah, building on this, Mike Schrager. Is there a difference between, Professor, a green bond and a sustainability-linked bond? Because maybe I missed that, but in linking to what this gentleman just asked, H&M, for instance, issues a sustainability-linked bond and says, we have to achieve these targets, and if we don't, we get worse terms, interest rates, and those things. And so my first question, have I misunderstood, or is there a difference? And if there is a difference, could those types of formats be more impactful?
Good question.
Very good question. Still an open question. So ever since just for everyone, the green bonds are kind of the oldest kid on the block of ESG fixed income instruments. Ever since the market started, now what we observe is there is blue bonds, ocean bonds, social bonds, COVID bonds. I'm missing a couple of, and then sustainability-linked bonds, which, as you say, so green bonds, there it's about the purpose of what do you invest in, what you describe in the prospectus, correct? But it's not tied to any actual impact. Now, sustainability-linked bonds, they are the terms, the interest rate, coupon rate, or the conditions, so to speak. They are tied to the actual improvement or not of environmental performance. So there is a difference. Are they really effective? It's too early, too soon to tell. The market is very young. And I'm not aware of any study that has looked at this, but it needs to be done. Yes. So, overall, ESG fixed income instruments could potentially be an important tool, correct? There is a lot of potential, but policy could help improve with transparency, with clarity, and also help those companies that actually want to transition, make it easier for them to get the trust from investors, etc., that they're really serious about it, essentially. But yeah, so many open questions in this market.
Yeah. Thank you. We need to wrap things up there, but please give it up for Caroline Flammer, first of all. Thank you. We're also going to say goodbye to our first fantastic panel, Lena Håkansson, Helena Samuelsson, Patrick Söderholm, Lorenz Torvet, and last but not least, Niklas Johansson. Thank you very much to all of them. So if you guys could make way for our next panelists, that would be brilliant. All right, so moving on, we're going to zoom in a little bit more on taxes now. We'll also be talking about opportunities within growth and job creation. And then we're going to be taking a break in just under an hour's time, so you'll have a chance to mingle a little bit and have some coffee and refuel. So let's first of all welcome the panelists that are going to be commenting on the next few speakers. I hope you're all here. Åsa Eriksson, Member of Parliament for the Social Democrats in Sweden. Helena Gellerman, Member of Parliament for the Swedish Liberal Party. Jon Hassler, Professor of Economics at Stockholm University. Elisabeth Tand Ringqvist, who's a business angel in investing in sustainable tech companies and founder and chair of Vaccine Forward. Thanks very much. And the first presentation in this section is from Cameron Hepburn, Professor of Environmental Economics at the University of Oxford. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Maddie, and it's a great pleasure to be in Stockholm in June. I can't think of any other month I'd rather be here, and I can certainly think of some where I wouldn't. But Oxford's lovely in June too. I wanted to talk to you about sensitive intervention points and to take a slightly more strategic approach to climate action. It's pretty clear where we are, which is to say that we're making some progress on climate change. We have net zero targets agreed around the world. If we were to deliver on them, we'd actually get to where we need to be. And we have the kind of reductions in the cost of clean technologies that Professor Grubb put up earlier that is very optimism inspiring. And we got the Paris architecture. But with all of that, we're radically not on track. Not even Sweden is on track, and the UK isn't on track to get to net zero by mid-century. And so what we've been doing in this paper, which we discussed yesterday, is what are the strategic approaches to pulling down these technologies, to doing the innovation, to delivering the change that we need? Can we think a little bit more systemically about what's required? And obviously carbon taxes is in the mix, but it's not the only part of the mix. And one of the things that came out from the previous discussion is just how multifaceted this transition is. It's economy-wide. It touches many sectors, many industries, and of course Sweden can't do it alone. And so what we've been doing in this paper is thinking about the interactions between the different components of this socio-technical transition. You've got your citizens voting, you've got government making policy decisions and regulating, you've got businesses, as we heard in the last panel, trying to work out what customers will pay a bit more for. And of course, consumers deciding what they like and how green they want to be and what they're willing to pay for. And this challenge, this transition, isn't simply about putting on a carbon price or doing a bit of R&D. These things are absolutely vital, of course. But we can see, you know, when a Swedish schoolgirl decides that she's had enough and starts protesting, that you can get viral behavior and large-scale social protests, which can then transmit into the concerns of parliamentarians, changing the legislative framework. You change the laws, and of course you have lawyers finding ways to sue companies for not behaving in a green enough manner. When this litigation starts to happen, you have Caroline and her colleagues thinking, well, we need financial disclosure, and perhaps the financial industry and other industries should be thinking about greenifying their financial basis. And that disclosure then leads to industry thinking, well, goodness, actually, I don't want to be exposed to these climate risks. Maybe I'm going to be investing in some new clean technologies. The cost comes down, consumers buy them. We have evidence that if you put a solar panel on your roof, you vote in a different way as well. So all of these things are interrelated. And what we've been trying to do in this paper and in a modeling team of about 20 at Oxford is to get some sense, both conceptually and quantitatively, of the links between these different components of the economy. And we're calling these interventions sensitive intervention points, or areas of the economy where you can make a change. They're not always small, as we heard in the last session. Sometimes it's multi-billions of krona being invested in order to transition an industry. But the message I want you to take away here is that in addition to carbon taxes and in addition to support for clean technologies, we need to be humble about the uncertainty ahead and take a bit of a venture capitalist sort of approach. Some of you will be familiar with that. It's a portfolio approach to policy. And in fact, we heard, I think, from Patrick in the panel this morning, that policy experimentation can be really rather valuable here. So we're in the middle of this piece of work. We've done an expert elicitation. I'm not expecting you to read what's up there on the slide on the left, but you can see we're rating different interventions according to a bunch of criteria. Some here won't surprise you. It makes sense for every country, and particularly for Sweden, as Professor Grubb said earlier. We're watching what's happening here in steel. It's incredibly interesting to us in the UK, but the whole world. Investing in clean tech where you get a sense that there will be cost declines makes a lot of sense. And we've been showing with statistical work at Oxford how you could identify whether you are likely to pull technologies down the cost curve or not. Some of these interventions might be legal. Actually, knowing that there are lawsuits coming at you if you haven't met your fiduciary duties, if you haven't started to transition in line with your country's commitment to net zero, can move things forward. Carbon prices, of course, are vital, and Sweden's had a great record here. Again, you are looked at across the world as an example of how to do it. My colleague Nick Stern at the LSE frequently says, if you need proof that you can have a good high carbon price and a functioning economy, just look at Sweden. But as I say, it's not just that. So I want to take one last intervention that's close to my heart, and then I'll wrap up. I think the part of the story here is properly understanding and modeling how the future is going to play out. Because if we have erroneous beliefs about the future, that can lead to erroneous capital allocation, which can lead to some pretty bad results. So let me give you an example. This black line shows the fall in costs of solar PV over the last few decades. These colorful lines show the forecasts at each point in time, so starting here and moving forwards from the International Energy Agency, of what the costs would likely to be in the future. As you can see, it's not a wonderful forecasting record because this chart here is in a log scale. So you go from here to here and you're off by a factor of 10. So they're frequently off by a factor of 10. Most economic forecasters who are off by a factor of 10 don't get to keep their jobs doing economic forecasting. You put these sorts of forecasts into a model of the global energy system, and by 2040, there's an increase in clean electricity. That's the blue bit there. You get to about perhaps a third of the system as clean electricity by 2040. But imagine we model better these innovative and technological processes that are pulling the costs down in solar. We base it on the data, and we get something like this. And you put that into a model of the global energy system by 2040, and most of it is clean electricity. You have a vast array of stranding of assets in coal and in gas and in oil. Now, depending on which one of these curves you believe, you're going to invest very differently. If you believe this one, there is large-scale scope for further investment in oil and gas and coal. You look at this, you think the world needs it. If you believe this one, why would you put your money there? And I think on that note, I'm going to end. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Please take a seat. We've just time for some quick reflections in this section. I'll start with Professor John Hassler. Would you like to kick things off?
Well, of course, I agree with your proposal that many different policies are needed in this transition. But I think it's important also to note that the transition to climate neutrality by 2050, which I think is what we need to do globally, that is not a large transition compared to many other things that society has gone through. I don't think that it's a larger transition than what happens through digitalization now in terms of investment needs, in terms of changed lifestyle, in terms of lost jobs and so on. This digitalization transition requires a lot of policies. What is the difference, though, is that the analog society is phasing out itself. That's not happening with the fossil society. And what is the requirement then? It is that it cannot continue to be free to use the atmosphere's capacity to absorb CO2 for free. So that's the fundamental thing. And when you put that in place, of course you need lots of other things. But I think it's very important to put that clearly in place, that it is the free access to that natural resource that the atmosphere's capacity to take up CO2 is, that has been free. That's the fundamental climate problem, and that needs to be fixed. Doing this, the other things are good too, but they are not substitutes.
Okay, some strong opinions there, thank you. We heard a bit about taking more of a VC approach to things, so perhaps we could get some perspective from Elizabeth, who's working in that space.
Thank you, and thank you for interesting presentation. I think that I would think about the portfolio strategy that you mentioned, and I, having been previously in public service, I think about how difficult it is as a country or the government or the local region to invest in something that you think would be good for climate. So that would be picking winners, which we obviously don't like, and that is usually a terrible strategy. But if you think about it as you don't pick winners, but you invest in a portfolio of different climate-changing technologies, that would be, and then you don't evaluate each and every project, because each and every project is going to be some of those that will be dead. That's how I work. I know that 5 of my investments are going to be sort of bankruptcy, and 2 of them going to be okay, and 1 is hopefully that's going to make my portfolio be fantastic. And I think if we could think about that in how we also invest as a society, then we would be much better off than evaluating each and every project. So that's a way of, and I know it's very difficult to prove in academically, but it's if you really think that climate issue is a big struggle, then I think that picture that you showed about all the ecosystem, all the actors that sort of get engaged in climate change issues. One thing that's missing there is capital, which obviously for all these different stakeholder groups, capital is increasingly important. And just adding on to the discussion about green bonds do not trickle down to the venture capital industry. It's only, you have to have, green bonds must be, 200, 400 million Swedish crowns, so sort of 20 to 50 million US dollars. Because institutional people don't sort of wake up in the morning and for less money than that. So we need to figure out a way to get those green bonds also into the really innovative space, because the LKABs and the others they need also the entrepreneurial innovation to make sure that the whole chain of materials and batteries will work.
Thank you. Let's pick up from the political side of things. I'm guessing you can't afford a bankruptcy with public money, and also in terms of vote winning. So what's your take on all of this?
I have a couple of comments. First of all, it was very interesting to hear. And I represent the Social Democratic Party, and we, of course, like to do things together to combat climate change and other crises. And I really enjoy what you said with people investing on solar panels on the roofs. They seem to vote differently. That was very good to hear. I think we need even more subsidizers on solar panels. But what we try to do with policies is, of course, to make this field of good investments and in the right way, so we can combat climate change together. And I think that we see that in Sweden we have been pretty successful the last 10 years or so, since we are leading in many areas. And we've heard today that other countries are looking at our companies and how we can lead the transition and so on. So I think that policy is very important, and we have to think long term, of course. And to comment on your curves on how the price on solar panels would develop, I think we try to have long-term agreements. We had 5 years ago, an agreement on energy, just to make sure that investors and others should know what would be prioritized, what kind of investments would we like to see in order to make trust and stability and make sure that we get the right investments. Unfortunately, some political parties left that agreement, so we don't have it anymore, which is a pity. But maybe we can get some kind of agreement again to make sure that we have investors that would like to be there and make the investments that we need in innovation.
Thank you. Well, let's hear from Helena from the centre-right opposition Liberals. What's your take?
Yes, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I think there are several things that will help change, especially what's happening globally now with the climate. But I also agree with John Hustler here about that I was in a panel for digitalization yesterday, and there are many issues there, and I think that the drives for going through digitalization is not as obvious as for the climate change. And I agree that one of the main things are that the polluter should pay. That is one of the core things in our policies. At the same time, I think it's very important that we understand that we need an acceptance for the policy that we have, because this will go on for maybe at least 20 years. And therefore, if we push it, it has to go fast, but if we push it too much, there will be a public, rejection. And we will go into different policies that will not help climate change. So therefore, we need to have a good speed, but we still need to have people with us in this. I think that is one of the things that we need to keep in mind. But I think polluter pays is the most important one. And also that we do it on, we look at Sweden here, and we have taxes, and it goes pretty well for us. But at the same time, I think it's more important, at least for me, that we use the EU, that we make policies on an EU level, because that's climate is, it's not national, it's global. And I think we can use EU as a push to change not only EU, but also it's a big market, so we can use EU to actually push changes in other countries, on other continents.
Thanks very much. We've got two more speakers to get through, so I can just take one burning question if anyone has one. Yes, please.
A short question. So I think the environmental problems are larger to some extent than the climate, and the problem with not in my backyard. So the problem is we need more energy, and even though we use windmills or solar panels, you will need metals. And we have lots of metals, for example, in Sweden, but people don't want us to have more of mining. Do you think there is a need for some compensation for people living in these areas that will be very affected by our struggle to combat climate change, but there will be in small areas effect on the...
You mean the indigenous Sami population in the north? Or
yeah, so there has been discussions. We have these local authorities, then they can decide that they don't want more windmills, but if we can have some kind of compensation to people living there.
It is a big issue. I think we'll take one quick response from the representing the government party, the Social Democrats.
Well, thank you. It's a very important question, and I totally agree with you. I do think that we need some kind of compensation, and we've been talking about that, especially when it comes to the Sami culture, especially. We're also looking into it when it comes to the windmill, and people are affected to that by that. But also, it is. I would say that the view on opening a mine is very different depending on where in Sweden you are. I come from Bergslagen, where we have a long, long history of mining, and we're very proud of it. So if someone said, well, now I'm investing in a mine in Norberg, people would be sharing because we know that it's growth, it's jobs. But I do think in order to make it happen everywhere where we need it, we do need to look into some kind of compensation, yes.
Yeah, has been an interesting discussion, and how much collaboration and involvement is needed on that continues to raise a lot of questions. But thank you very much to our first speaker, Cameron, for this section. We'll say goodbye to you, and I'll introduce our next guest. Thanks very much. Cameron Hepburn from the University of Oxford there. Okay, so our next presentation is called 5 Myths About Carbon Pricing, and we're going to hear from Gilbert E. Metcalf from the Department of Economics at Tufts University. Welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And this paper is a bit unusual, the paper that I gave yesterday in this discussion today, because it may seem odd to be in a country that's had such a robust and long-lived carbon pricing policy with a carbon tax going back to the early 1990s. But of course, I come from the United States where there's a lot of misinformation, what are sometimes called alternative facts by some people. And we really have to struggle to get the information out about what carbon pricing is and how it can work. So obviously, we have a real climate problem. I don't think I need to say much about this. We have rising temperatures that are due in large part to increased concentrations of greenhouse gases. So we know we have this climate problem, and we've heard today about the need for a wide range of policies, approaches. Michael Grubb and both Cameron Hepburn have really emphasized that, and we have a great example with green bonds. But carbon pricing is clearly an important part of this policy. But of course, in many parts of the world, and certainly in the United States, there are real political hurdles. And one of the hurdles is just the misinformation about carbon pricing. And with that misinformation, we feel a bit sometimes like we're pushing a very heavy rock up a very steep hill. So our goal is to try to address that. So here are the myths that I talked about in our workshop yesterday, and I really just want to focus to provide a little bit of evidence that, again, are probably not a surprise to anyone in this room, but the evidence in terms of the economic impact as well as the equity impact of carbon pricing, and in particular a carbon tax. So we now have had carbon tax systems in place long enough that we can really do rigorous empirical research to understand the impact of these policies. And so looking both at the province of British Columbia, as well as the 15 countries in Europe that have carbon taxes, in addition to being part of the EU emission trading system, there is really very robust evidence that there is simply no support for the idea that a carbon tax will hurt economic growth or employment. Now, obviously, we see sectoral shifts in employment, though what I found really interesting from the first panel discussion was how in the iron ore and the steel industry, we perhaps may not see the kinds of shifts in employment out of those sectors as we move to clean production methods. So I think that's quite encouraging. Now, the regressivity question, I think, is a very important one because this often is posed as an obstacle to carbon pricing when the proposals are put up, particularly with carbon taxes. It is very clear that a carbon tax is going to raise the cost of energy, and energy is a higher share of the budgets for low-income households. And so from that perspective, it very much looks like this is a regressive policy, meaning that the tax is a bigger burden as a share of income for lower-income households than higher-income households. Well, that story is only part of the message. The other part of the message is that a carbon tax is a business tax, and as such is also going to be a tax that falls on workers, shareholders, the owners of resources, and in that respect, it may be, depending on the evidence, it may be that it affects capital owners more than workers, which would add to the progressivity of the reform, or vice versa. The evidence, you just have to look at the data. The other piece of it is that certainly in the United States, we have a large number of indexed transfer programs that are an important element of the budgets for lower income households. And those transfer payment programs tend to be indexed for inflation. So to the extent that a carbon tax were to raise the overall price level, households receiving transfer payments are in some sense sheltered from that higher tax increase. So you've got different forces at work, and when you put it together, there's been several studies now, one that I did with colleagues at MIT about a decade ago, and a more recent work from colleagues at Stanford and Resources for the Future that show that if a carbon tax were to be done in the United States, it is taking all of these factors into account, proportional to mildly progressive, meaning we don't have this very large regressive impact. And that's before we even think about what do we do with the revenue. And once you think about the use of revenue, you have considerable political flexibility. One proposal in the United States is to return the revenue to households through a carbon dividend. And if you do that, this chart shows households from the poorest households on the left going to the richest households on the right, and the black line then beyond that sort of breaks out the highest 10% of the households. But what it shows is that with a carbon dividend, you can actually the dividend that would equal dividends going to all households would actually compensate the lowest income groups more than they would be facing in higher prices of goods and services because of the carbon tax. So it actually turns out to be a highly progressive reform. So I'll conclude just to say that we clearly need a portfolio of policies. A carbon tax is one of those. It uses the power of the market in a very clean way to sort of send the right signal. And here I think political leadership to bring this forward is important, and I think it's really important to stress, as previous speakers have as well, that the leadership that Sweden has shown has been extraordinarily important in helping to push this idea globally. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Gilbert. Please take a seat. All right, so yes, we've been hearing a difficult political lift in some parts of the world, less so in others. Let's start with Helena from the Liberals. Some reflections on the presentation, please.
Yes, I can say that I...
Just flip on.
So. Yes, I think your presentation is very interesting. And this is actually pushing for polluter pays taxes is one of the main thing actually to get change. And we think that, as I mentioned before, that the EU ETS, where we have taxes on extortions, climate gases, is the best way of doing it than on the EU level. And then you can have others on a national level, but as we're putting more and more into that general climate tax, I think we need to look at all the taxes that we have nationally to see, as I said, it has to be acceptance to what we do, and so that it doesn't become too much. I think it has to be a really easy system, and my reflections on giving out revenues to all people is that I think it will stop change if I look at an EU perspective, because we have a very good system now, and if we were to change that, we would actually halt the change. So from my perspective, I think we should keep to the system that we have today. But if you are introducing new taxes, it might be a good way to do it that way.
Thank you. We'll take Helena's perspective, Åsa's perspective next.
Well, thank you. And I agree that the EU ETS has been very efficient. But as we all know, emissions are global, and we need a global system. And I think that the EU initiative CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, I think it is a very good initiative that might help make it more global. And the purpose is to reduce the leakage of emissions, to have some tariffs on for instance, steel imported from countries where they're not so responsible in their production. And as a social democrat, at first I was skeptical to CBAM, because we're always pro-free trade, and we're working against tariffs and so on. But after talking to the steel industry, I understood that this is exactly what we need to do to make a level playing field also, and to protect the companies within the EU and Sweden who are taking the lead and are responsible and investing in making their products more sustainable. So now I'm totally pro CBAM, and I think that might be a good tool to get a global system.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You're scribbling furiously. Let's get some perspective from the VC side of things.
I'll say there's multiple sources here. So I'm thinking about one thing that has been very important as an investor is that the carbon pricing has been you could look at it as a very long-term commitment because you know that it would not shift next year. So as an investor, I look at a company and see what will the value of this company be in 2030, and I know that these rules and regulations probably they can be amended a little bit, but probably be there. So it gives security and saying, well, a company that is working to decrease CO2 will probably be more worth than one that does not. It's very simple investment logic. So therefore, I think that's one of the traits of this that's very, very good. I'm thinking about so one market that does not exist yet is the market for creating the carbon removal technology. If I have a company that is creating something about carbon removal technology, I don't know about the demand because there's nobody to buy it yet. So I think it's super interesting that companies like Meta and Alphabet and Stripe, they together created a fund of 10 billion Swedish crowns to be there to say, if you have this technology, we will buy your carbon removal technology in the future. So it's sort of a futures program that's not yet there, but there's sort of imaginary there. So it's another way of investing in future technology. And I have sort of 3 questions back. When you talk about what do you do about the taxes? Is the society better off doing the dividends? Or is it better off to just, having some extra money to the regular budget? Or is it to invest in new technology? Is there any knowledge of that?
So very quickly, for the carbon removal, I think we clearly need a price to pay for that, and so subsidies are going to be important there. And in terms of the use of the revenue, I am now quite agnostic about that. My view is whatever use of revenue is most effective to get a policy in place. Well, I mean, there could be ways that are quite terrible, but I think political acceptability would be one of the guiding principles for me. And beyond that, I think different countries will have different preferred uses of revenue. I leave it to them to figure that out.
Thank you. Professor Hassler, any concluding comments from you?
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with what you said, that we can be fairly sure that a transition to climate neutrality in the world by 2050 can be done without sacrificing growth or having any distributional consequences that we can't deal with. So that's clear. So it's a bit of a pedagogical problem to get acceptance for these things. In addition, of course, lots of policies are needed. Economists have long said that putting a price on emissions can be done either by taxes and emission trading, and we heard some discussion about that already. And many economists have favored taxes or fees, I think is a better word. It's not a tax, it's a fee on using that natural resource. I think that there are pedagogical and also maybe structural reasons for favoring emission trading, and that is that an emission trading system rhymes with the idea that we have a natural resource that we can't use more than a particular amount of. And people and politicians care about the questions of what is the consequences of putting a price in terms of how much emissions are going to be reduced. Is the price enough, and so on. Putting instead an emission trading system with explicit limits on the amount of emissions kind of solves that issue. You don't need to discuss whether this is enough or not. So that's a good thing. Another thing is that I think there we know that if you have a price, a tax or a fee, it has to rise over time. Our research shows that it needs to follow GDP approximately, and that's a bit of a complication. It's difficult kind of to commit to follow that path. So I think it's actually it seems like it's easier to commit to a path of how much emission allowances are entering the market, and it seems also like that idea is winning ground in the world. It's not a big issue. Both would work, but maybe it's pedagogically easier with an emission trading system, perhaps even in the US.
Interesting points. Any final questions for Professor Gilbert or the panel? Do I see any hands? No. Would you like to make any concluding comments before we move on to the next speaker?
No, these are fair comments, and I in terms of whether we do carbon trading, cap and trade, or a carbon tax, clearly both of these approaches are very efficient approaches, and I think the institutional environment may end up being the driving factor for which approach you take. And clearly in the EU, the fact that you need unanimity for fiscal measures in the EU was a big driver for why the EU went for a cap and trade system.
Thank you very much, Professor Gilbert Metcalfe. Thank you. Okay, last but not least, before we head to the coffee break, we're going to hear from Kelly Sims-Gallagher, Professor of Energy and Environmental Policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and the title of her presentation is Job Creation and Deep Carbonisation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I am going to pick up on one of the threads from our two members of Parliament, which is really about the importance of thinking about jobs and job creation as part of the strategy for deep decarbonization. But let me first make the link to innovation, because economic viability strongly depends on innovation. I think we know that. And there's many important dimensions to innovation for those of us who have studied the innovation process, including having clarity about your goals. You may not pick winners, but you have to make strategic choices. You have to make strategic investments. You have to create strong networks, nurture entrepreneurship, and last but not least, you have to create human capacity. If you don't have the people who can affect this transition, you won't succeed. And I really am going to focus my remarks on the need to develop the workforce for deep decarbonization, because I think the key to achieving sustainable prosperity while also achieving deep decarbonization is to pay attention to the people who will enact or affect these transitions. The term just transition is one you might have heard of, and it's a way to talk about this social transition that's so important to achieve this goal. This term just transition refers to equitable transitions, the need to protect the workers that will be displaced in the transition, whether because they work in a fossil fuel industry or an energy-intensive industry, or in a region that depends on them. And that region may depend on royalties or tax revenue to pay for the schools and the local hospital. So my argument is that popular support for decarbonization is conditional on most people's belief that their economic well-being will improve, or at least not suffer with these policies. In other words, this question is, will they advocate for the transition, vote for the transition, or will they try to block it? There's obviously several types of industries that we can think about supporting in this low-carbon transition, and then the workers that would be needed in these industries. The clean energy industry is obvious. Renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy storage, all of those will be needed to allow for the transition. And then we can think about industries that don't need to use fossil fuels or are capturing fossil fuels and storing them, because they can contribute to the economy and create jobs without increasing greenhouse gas emissions. Any industry that can be electrified would fit into this category, assuming the electricity is produced carbon-free. And finally, we definitely cannot forget the industries that will provide the goods and services necessary to foster climate resilience, because climate change is clearly upon us. And it is inevitable at this point that we will have a certain degree of climate change. So if you turn to the literature, the scholarly literature about the importance of workforce development and job creation or job loss in the support for or lack of support for climate policy and deep decarbonization, I'm just going to give you three examples. Here in Europe, a study tracing the growth of political support for wind subsidies in Germany found that very high political support for renewable energy policies was created when workers from the shipbuilding industry found new employment in the emerging wind industry, because, of course, the diversification of the economy enabled them to find new jobs. And political coalitions between farmers, shipbuilding workers, and wind companies led to very strong local support for wind projects in coastal regions in Germany. Conversely, a 2014 Norwegian study found that support for or opposition to climate mitigation policies was associated with individual economic interests. And specifically, industries that were employed in the oil and gas sector in Norway were much less likely to believe that climate change was a serious threat and much less likely to support climate policy. In the United States, a very recent study found that the distributional effects of climate policies strongly influence public support. So concentrating on the left behind workers seemed to be the key priority for increasing the political acceptability of such policies. And more importantly, anticipating and ameliorating the negative effects of new climate policies would be ideal from a policymaking perspective. Now today, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we recognize there's also a lot of additional motivations for the types of policies that would have co-benefits for climate change. So energy security is one that I think feels very salient today, given the rising prices in energy markets. And this helps us realize that a sequencing of policies may be necessary to build the political support to enact more stringent climate laws. Specifically, green industrialization policies that lead to the establishment of new green industries in a given country creates industries that are, and workers in them that are interested in advocating for themselves in new and additional policies. And because these new industries create jobs along the way, you have this sort of virtuous cycle that ensues. And the blocking power of interests that wish to slow down the transitions can be diminished. So I'm going to leave you with 4 policy implications. First, you want to design innovation policies that are designed to systematically both push and pull these low-carbon industry or clean energy industries into the marketplace. But you want to be attentive to job creation in that process. Second, you need to make job creation conditional on government support, or sorry, the other way around. You need to make government support conditional on job creation. If firms are not able to generate new jobs, you're going to lose this sort of beneficial effect of creating broad societal support for the transition. Third, and this may be a little controversial, industrial policy does require some planning because resources are inevitably limited. No country is going to be competitive in all low-carbon industries. So choices will have to be made about where to concentrate policy effort and fiscal resources. And of course, each country must determine its own sources of comparative advantage and then develop this plan for how to exploit their competitive advantage. And then these plans should inform policymaking for each industry. At the subnational level, you might think about this very regionally. this region of a certain country may have, a particular resource that could be exploited. We heard some examples of mining resources. And then you can develop these plans accordingly. And finally, workforce development is the fourth crucial type of needed policy. And this could take the form of scholarships for students who wish to work in low-carbon industries, and also funds for retraining workers from high-carbon legacy industries, coupled with living stipends while they're undergoing their retraining process. So with that, let me stop.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Please take a seat. Lots of food for thought there. Let's start with you, Professor John Hassler. What's your take on the importance of the jobs market and how much you think that could help people accept climate concessions?
So for sure, this is very important. And we know, I don't think it's a big deal perhaps in Sweden, but go to Poland, they have 80,000 coal miners and they need to do something else. On the other hand, one shouldn't exaggerate either. Poland had 400,000 coal miners a couple of decades ago. And if you go to the US, an example I sometimes take is that the number of people working in fossil fuel extraction in the US, that is about as many people as was replaced by these automatic counters at McDonald's that was recently introduced. So it is important because also small groups can be detrimental for the policies that are required. But it's not a tremendously large problem. It needs to be focused on for sure, but we can do it without doubt.
Thank you. Let's hear from the politicians. We'll start with you, Helena.
Yes, I think your presentation was very interesting. And it took a broad view on what we should do as politicians. Our climate program is actually called Climate Change in a Growing Economy. So it fits right in. We think that trade, innovation and entrepreneurship will be the factors that will actually make us save the climate. And I think that what you point out is very much about job change. And I think that is very important. I think that now it becomes obvious. We talked about lifelong education for a very long time. I think now it has actually become obvious that you need to re-educate many times during your lifetime. And I think there, when I talk to many different companies and organizations, they always bring up competence, that they don't find the people that will make them do the green change. So I think that is an area where we as politicians need to focus more. How can we help people to re-educate and actually take these jobs? That is one important, and that is also what I talked about before. That is one of the ways to get acceptance. Because, and I agree with John here that I don't think we will see mass unemployment. Of course, from a Swedish perspective, but if we look at it globally, there will be challenges. But at the same time, if we really focus on re-education, I think this is doable.
What do you think, also? Traditionally, your sort of classic voter base comes from more traditional industries.
Exactly, and I totally agree with everything you said, and I'm very interested in hearing more about your 4 bullet points later on. But what I heard, even though you didn't say it, is that 2 of the main ingredients in why Sweden is so successful right now in the transition is that we, have very strong unions, and they are very progressive. They know that there is not wise to cling on to yesterday's job because it will disappear sooner or later. So it's much better that we are progressive and looking forward and helping out with the development and innovation and digitalization for tomorrow's jobs. And I think that's very it's good for the employers too to work together with unions. And secondly, in Sweden we have a very long history of a publicly financed educational system. So exactly like Helena said, you can educate yourself throughout your whole life, which is very important, that we have social security systems and so on, so that people dare to educate themselves for tomorrow's jobs. And I think that are two of the very important ingredients to why we are where we are today. Not the only ones, but they are important, and we need to make sure that we make them even better.
Great reflections on the other parts of the jigsaw adding together here, and some final points from you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I was thinking about your first policy recommendation, of course, which is about the push and pull of innovation and designing that. Currently, the market sentiment globally is geared towards creating, investing in companies creating value and not growth. And at the same time, we have a lot of money pouring into sustainable investment, but that are much bigger investments, sort of building where you can use the green bonds on building an energy efficient house. That's very easy. It's much more difficult to go into investments that will have a payoff in 5 to 10 years. That is not scalable in 2 to 3 years. It's not an app that you can see consumer pick up and you have like very good metrics from month to month. So all these innovations that actually will take some more time will need a lot of more capital. And I didn't think of myself saying that, but it's the systems that we have in Sweden with the Almi Green Tech, and we have the Industrial Fund and others. They will be very important in scaling some of the crucial climate change entrepreneurial innovations going forward. That was, I mean, obviously, from all the investments that's going on in battery and in green steel, there will be offsprings of that, and we need to make sure that those offsprings will scale globally very quickly, because companies in Sweden scale much slower because access to capital for deep tech innovation is very scarce.
So speed and planning, two topics that keep coming up. Do we have any final questions for Kelly? Yes, one from Pontus.
Thank you. If you go back only 10 years, there was a lot of alarmistic reports coming up about the effect of digitization on jobs. And there was a fear of massive losses of jobs. And you can go much further back in history. You can go back to the 1470s when the printing machine was invented and the wood carvers were demonstrating because they were afraid of losing their jobs. But today, if you compare with the digitization, today you don't hear very much about these fears about job losses. It's still around, but it's not the sort of alarmistic tune to it. So do you expect that we will see that as people get more accommodated to that there is a change going on, that also these fears will or worries will vanish?
Well, I think that the two sectors, I mean, in a way, decarbonization affects every part of the economy. So it's a little bit, and maybe you can argue digitization is the same, but I see more clearly winners and losers in the low carbon transition. I mean, clearly, if you're working in a coal industry, unless, you know, CCS really materializes and we start capturing and storing carbon, it doesn't, you know, have a long viability, right? But through technological innovation, a lot of the heavier industries, you know, I'm confident that we'll develop the technology and be able to make transition for many sectors. I guess if you'll indulge me 1 second, I'd like to respond to the first comment, which is really that I think we have to recognize Sweden as sort of this shining star on the hill in this process. And even so, I really appreciate your comments about the need to continuously work on upskilling and preparing the workforce to be able to adopt the cleaner technologies. But in most countries, that's not the case. I do a lot of work in China, which has hundreds of millions of coal miners still. And China's this very paradoxical place, right? Because you've got this amazing growth in the clean energy industry, and they have, you know, already conquered global solar markets and wind markets and increasingly battery for vehicle markets and electric vehicle. I mean, you know, you can kind of go sector by sector, but they also still have this tremendous overhang of a legacy workforce in high carbon industries, iron and steel and cement and coal. And China may be the most extreme example, but many other countries have this same stress. I put the United States somewhere in the middle where we have a very small coal mining workforce, but we have a very large oil and gas workforce that's very politically potent. So being attentive to how to make these transitions, I think, is important. And really, the argument I'm trying to make is that if we can create these new jobs strategically so that there's less risk, right, for all of the workers, and they feel like they have the capacity to shift from, say, an offshore oil and gas job to a offshore wind turbine job, they're much more likely to embrace the transition and support it.
Yeah, some really interesting concluding comments, and I think useful for those of us here in Scandinavia to reflect that it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not necessarily do as was done here. We've got to look globally and holistically at all of this. Please give it up for Kelly Sims-Gallagher. Thank you very much. And I'm going to say thank you to our panelists before we head into the coffee break. John Hassler, Åsa Eriksson, Helena Gelman, and Elisabeth and Rinqvist. Thank you very much. And I know you're all probably dying for coffee. We've got a half an hour coffee break to give you the chance to refuel, hopefully do a bit of mingling. The coffee is taking place upstairs, and it would be great if you could be back here at 11 o'clock sharp. Thank you.